That's for introductions and kind of like a backup.
Okay, so under the shirt.
And you don't have to turn it on.
Oh, just around the cup?
Yeah. You can put it under if you want, but we'll clip it on there.
And then, is it better on the shirt or on the lapel?
I think we'll put it on the other side, like this.
Okay, you're the expert.
Can I do that? Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
for sure. That good?
That'll work. Yep.
Okay, and on the
belt or in your pocket or wherever is easier.
Okay, maybe here. Uh-oh. And then, is it already on?
It's already on, but I have it muted, so I'll bring it up when you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, all set.
Great.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, put her here. Yeah, then her just come sit beside you. Yeah, you never know. Maybe she's on a later schedule.
Yes, it's fun.
Oh yeah, I think we're on Harvard time, but still, they say Harvard time is 7 minutes after. That's what I've been taught, Beth. But still, it is. It's after 12.
Yeah. I think
Was Christian going to give us the go ahead? Oh, okay, no. Oh, she's out there. Oh, okay. I think Harvard time they taught me is 7 minutes after the hour.
Yep.
That's for when you're teaching, yeah?
It's the time, everything starts at the time you're going to leave your location to arrive at the time.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
I see her.
Oh, no problem. Oh, you know what? I'll go check. Oh, this chair is hard to get out of.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's colloquium, the first of the semester. Professor Gates is on his way, but let us start. Let me remind you that the next colloquium will be delivered by Genevieve Dempsey, and she will be speaking on Lives of Sacred Forest, Axé, Musical Explorations in Brazil's Candomblé. Hello.
Hi, Chris.
I started without you, sorry.
I have class Monday and Wednesday, so I'll always be slightly like zip it up here.
Okay, thank you. Now please welcome to the podium Marissa Parham. She's professor of English at Amherst College and director of the Immersive Reality Lab for the Humanities at Amherst.
Thank you so much for that. How are you guys doing today?
Fine.
Awesome. So needless to say, you can probably tell from my whole affect, I'm very excited to be able to introduce Dr. Charmaine Nelson. Nelson currently is the William Lyon Mackenzie King Visiting Professor of Canadian Studies here at Harvard, and is more generally Professor of Art History at McGill. Professor Nelson is the author of numerous books, and her research and teaching interests include post-colonial and Black feminist scholarship, transatlantic slavery studies, and Black diaspora studies. Her scholarship examines Canadian, American, European, and Caribbean art and visual culture. I've been thinking a lot lately about how we all, I think, as scholars often have this sort of imagination of what we think the good work looks like. And I think it's really exciting to come across a scholar who very much exemplifies what it means to be able to move across discourses, to be able to move across disciplines, and to think very broadly about very important questions that move in, I think, very elegantly in her work between this very specific and a very generalized meaning the most useful sense of a broader culture and a broader world. In thinking about the legacies and precipitates of slavery in the Americas, it is critical that we understand the range of materials generated in slavery's shadow and learn new ways to account for their meaning and impact. Professor Nelson has made groundbreaking contributions to the fields of the visual culture of slavery, race and representation, Black Canadian studies, and African Canadian art history. Nelson's work is characterized in an erudite wrangling of multiple genres, disciplines, and often seemingly disparate source materials. In Slavery, Geography, and Empire, for instance, Professor Nelson asks us to think about convergencies and divergencies of slavery across Western climate zones, comparing temperate and tropical slavery, for instance. Exploring a vast range of and moving elegantly between primary sources that include travel narratives, plantation ledgers, merchant cash books, and planters' journals. This is an example of the kind of ways in which we must be able to take very seriously the ways in which slavery produced artifacts across, again, cultural discourses that must be made to speak to one another. I was also, to be honest, so happy to realize that Professor Nelson is also the proprietor of BlackCanadianStudies.com. As a digital humanist, I've been talking a lot lately about how digital humanities writ large must do a better job of accounting for how the kinds, must do a better job of accounting for the kinds of communities that scholars, and particularly scholars of color, have been building on the web. Black Canadian Studies exemplifies the best of what it means to parlay and develop resources in relation to larger social, cultural, and academic enterprises, the kinds of enterprises for which so many of us are asked to take leadership and are looking for new ways to do that leadership in ways that to us feel honest, meaningful, and will have long-standing benefit. Needless to say, I want you to join me in my excitement to hear Professor Nelson today. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you for such a wonderful welcome. That's so heartwarming. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to see you again, Professor Gates. Thank you, Krishna, for inviting me, for having me. Thank you all for taking your lunchtime to be here with me. So I'll say...
Except Skip, my brother's professor.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. So I'll say at the top that when I use the horrible colonial terms, I'm mining them from the slave ads, okay? So just so you know where they're coming from, because I think it's important to recognize the language that was used in the period. The other thing is that it's a work in progress. I'm heading towards a book, and I've published a couple chapters already, but I welcome your comments and your questions, your feedback at the end. All right, so I will jump in, and you'll see I have a lot of images for you here. The Montreal Gazette issued its first paper on the 25th of August, 1785. That the first runaway slave ad appeared the following month, by the 29th of September, demonstrates the local white settlers' knowledgeable use of print technology to perpetuate the colonial racial order through which their ownership of black bodies was justified and secured. Although an archive of slave sale, auction, and fugitive ads exists alongside other legal, private, and government documents in the provinces of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, and Newfoundland, Canadian participation in transatlantic slavery under the French and British empires is little known both inside and outside of the nation. What replaces it is celebratory narratives of the Underground Railroad and the liberation of enslaved African Americans by good white Canadian abolitionists. This paper is an attempt to disrupt this narrative by remembering the centuries-long presence of people of African descent, both free and enslaved, in the regions which became Canada. I also wish to explore the complexity and heterogeneity of this historical Black Canadian population by mining the archive of Quebec Fugitive Slave Advertisements for evidence of the ethnicity and birth origin of the enslaved population. The runaway slave ad is a primary source with prescribed limits. The limit of the slave ad is that it confirms only that someone socially deemed to be a slave was thought to have run away from the person who claimed to own the runaway. It is important to note that the archive, however, can never fully capture the extent of resistance through flight in any given region. Since colonial newspapers were historically published only weekly, an enslaved person's quick recapture foreclosed the need for the printing of a fugitive notice. We can then surmise that many more people escaped than were ever documented in these notices. The runaway slave ad can provide for us a window into the lives and worlds of the enslaved. Each example was about the recapture of an individual or individuals who had fled, and as such required that their owners share details that illuminated what made the runaways unique, both in manner and appearance. As such, runaway slave advertisements, ubiquitous across the Americas, are repositories of data on enslaved populations. And these are some of the things that you can mine rather regularly from the ads, some of the categories. As David Waldstreicher has noted, such ads were generally premised on 4 categories: clothing, trades and skills, linguistic ability or usage, and ethnic or racial identity. Categories the manipulation of which could alter the perceptions of one's class or race. Accents were also used both to identify how a fugitive might sound when encountered and to indicate to where they might be fleeing. For example, when the merchant John Turner Sr. placed a notice for the return of, quote, a Negro slave named Ishmael in the Quebec Gazette on the 29th of July, 1779, he described him as having a tone of voice peculiar to New England where he was born, end quote. But the appearance of the fugitive's body, both biological, so think skin color, hairstyle and texture, height and build, etc., and how the fugitive adorned themselves, the color, material, type, and style of clothing, footwear, wigs, scarification, etc., were paramount. The advertisements in and of themselves are testaments to the necessity of deception as a survival tactic of the enslaved. Since ads regularly included descriptions of the dress and speech of the fugitive, even when the slave owner did not explicitly document the regional origins of the enslaved person, there are evidence of the ethnicity of the slave population, their Creoleness or Africanness. However, in my larger project, what I am after is not merely an understanding of how Creole identity was named and distinguished verbally or textually from Africanness, but how it became visualized on the bodies, in the habits, mannerisms, and dress of the enslaved. My research project examines late 18th and early 19th century fugitive slave ads, as a form of transatlantic visual culture in 3 key sites. So Canada, here meaning Nova Scotia and Quebec, and Jamaica. The focus of my lecture today will be British Quebec between the dates of 1760, which is the year of capitulation when the British seized New France from the French and renamed it Quebec, into the early 1800s. In the context of Quebec, Frank Mackey has determined that 94 notices concerning the sale of black slaves and the flight of black prisoners, ship deserters, servants, and slaves were published in early newspapers. While around 40 enslaved men, women, and children were offered for sale in 43 notices, the last advertised in 1798, 45 people of African descent took part in 50 escapes, the last also in 1798, and were listed in about 51 fugitive notices. The multiple escapes of certain individuals accounts for the fact that the number of notices is greater than the number of enslaved individuals. One of my key concerns is whether or not the enslaved in Canada and Jamaica could distinguish the ethnicity and birth origin of their fellow bondspeople, how they could discern such things, and what this meant to their intergroup politics, interaction, and communication. Furthermore, how aware were the enslaved of the transformation in their cultural practices as they changed over a lifetime and across generations from Africans to Creoles? And if Creoles were by definition supposedly more apt to be seasoned or broken, what did this mean for cross-ethnic alliances in terms of resistance and rebellion?
Explain to people what you mean by Creole, because they get confused thinking you're talking about mixed race people.
Okay, so Creole in the British Atlantic world was a term meaning born in the colonies. So it has no indication of the person's race or ethnic background. Okay. Furthermore, despite its usefulness, I would like to offer alternatives for the catch-all racial term black, which in its homogenizing universality assumed a creolized subject. In the context of these specific parts of the transatlantic world, I would like to ask, when was blackness? In Jamaica, where hundreds of enslaved people lived together on plantations thousands of acres in size, did a black majority translate into greater opportunities for the performance and preservation of one's African ethnicity? Did what Ira Berlin has called the radical separation of master and slave and the creation of the worlds of the big house and the quarters provide a physical buffer which provided the enslaved with the unsupervised room to preserve their African cultures? Or did the immediate expropriation of their African past inhibit the practice and maintenance of cultural knowledge? Contrarily, did the proximity of the enslaved to their owners in the urban spaces of Halifax, Montreal, and Quebec City, and the heavy burden of continual surveillance inhibit cultural preservation? Scholarship on Canadian slavery has used the term black as a catch-all racial term that masks the heterogeneity of the population. Likewise, the term African Canadian should more aptly be used only to describe people of African descent who had transgenerational experiences of creolization in Canada. A discussion of creolization in Canada must also consider the simultaneous enslavement of Indigenous people who were known as Pawnee, P-A-N-I-S, as male and an E added to the end if it was a female, and Africans under the French and the British empires. Certain categories of naming reoccur, even dominate in fugitive slave advertisements. While the first name of the enslaved person is almost always provided, family names were rare since the process of enslavement customarily entailed the stripping of the African's entire name and the imposition of the owner's family name. Significantly, this pattern is the reverse of slave sale ads in which the name of the enslaved person was commonly withheld. The namelessness of the enslaved person surely heightened their commodification for the potential buyers, dehumanizing them and driving home the idea that they were merely an object for sale, muscle and flesh ready to be bent to the will of a new owner. but surely too this deliberate refusal to provide what was arguably in regions where slave owners were familiar with each other's slave holdings, the most obvious identifying information, was a means to impede potential buyers from ascertaining troubling information about an enslaved person. This was surely the case when the merchant James Johnson and John's Purse placed an enslaved woman named Bet for sale in the Quebec Gazette in 1787, and you see that ad here. According to an earlier fugitive notice for her, Bet had absconded from the pair only a few months prior, in March of 1787. Alarmingly, the notice described Bet as being in a state of advanced pregnancy, big with child and within a few days of her time. As such, Johnson and Purse's description of the pregnant Bet not only disclosed the heightened value of the fleeing Bet, who according to colonial legal discourse literally carried what was tantamount to their property in her womb, but in the eyes of many white settlers tainted her as irresponsible and rash. Whereas it was rather common to withhold an enslaved person's first name in a slave sale ad, the same was not true for fugitive slave notices. In a rare example where the first name was withheld, the 1st of September 1766 notice of the merchant Isaac Worden claimed that a Negro girl of about 24 years of age had absconded on Saturday, the 22nd of August. Although he described her appearance, language acquisition, and dress, Worden oddly did not provide her first name. The Virginian planter Robert King Carter, the richest planter in the state, instructed his overseer to initiate a process of renaming of his enslaved Africans at the point of purchase. The process of renaming must have been a moment of great conflict. Although renaming was frequently a process wherein the enslaved person's removal from Africa could be cemented through the bestowal of a European name, naming practices in Jamaica and elsewhere in the Americas indicate that slave owners and their overseers often imposed names that deliberately recalled not just the African birth origins, but also the specific ethnicity of the enslaved. Jamaican Hope Estates, a list of Negroes on Hope Plantation in St. Andrews, dated 1788, listed 135 men, 41 boys, for a total of 176 males, 133 women and 42 girls, for a total of 175 females, several of whom were given such names, including Ebo Sampson, Angola Sampson, Ebo Tony, Ebo Fanny, Ebo Nancy, and Congo Suki. This practice was rooted not merely in a bid to easily distinguish between many enslaved people living in the same space, mainly a plantation, but also proved useful in the white desire to differentiate and hierarchize enslaved Africans on the basis of potential resistance as supposedly rooted in ethnicity. Contrarily, the retention of African names, naming practices, and the documentation of specific African origins and ethnicities are almost impossible to detect at the level of white interference or official documents in Nova Scotia and Quebec. This is largely due to the fact that the African-born portion of the slave minority population in both regions surely comprised the smallest percentage of these communities. It followed then that slave owners in these regions were less acquainted with African-born people and less capable of identifying them by ethnicity. Instead, slave owners in these two regions either proclaimed a generic African birth explicitly or implied it through a comment on language. The reason for the smaller population of African-born people was the nature of merchant enterprise in the regions. In the period of British rule, the merchant ships that arrived in ports like Halifax, Montreal, and Quebec City with enslaved people of African descent did not do so directly from Africa. Although analysis of these vessels and their human cargoes have yet to be undertaken, the Anglo-Caribbean origin of many of these ships would seem to suggest that the dominant enslaved population on board would most likely have been Creole or Caribbean-born people. Slave ships arriving from Africa were normal in the Caribbean, parts of South America, and the American South. Jamaican fugitive slave ads routinely listed the enslaved by both racial type and or African ethnicity. However, there were also regions in the American North where enslaved African-born populations became normal. Ira Berlin and Leslie M. Harris have linked the growth of the slave population in 18th century British New York to the increasing arrival of slave ships directly from Africa. It was a growth of this African-born population through which, quote, white New Yorkers learned to distinguish between Congos and Angolans, Mandis and Mandingos, as they became familiar with the differences amongst African peoples, end quote. White Canadian knowledge of Africanness surely paled in comparison. This deficit is revealed in the fugitive slave notices, specifically in how African-born enslaved people were identified. Of the 50 fugitive slave notices for 45 runaways, which Mackey has identified for Quebec, only 4 people were described in ways which stated or inferred that they were African-born. Interestingly, all 4 were males, and none of the descriptions provided a specific ethnicity. The first documented enslaved person, whose origins appear to have been African, was Drummond. However, John McCord's fugitive notice of 1765 did not explicitly state this fact. Rather, McCord's addendum that Drummond, quote, speaks very bad English and next to no French was the striking declaration which marked Drummond as outside of the linguistic norms of a Quebec Creole. William Gilliland's 1771 fugitive notice for a, quote, Negro man named Ireland, who had allegedly escaped with a white indentured servant named Francis Freeland, stated that Ireland, quote, speaks English tolerably plain, but no other language except that of his native country, Guinea. The 5 fugitive slave notices placed by William Brown were more direct than McCord's or Gilliland's. Perhaps the explicit statement of the origins of the fugitive can be related to Brown's position as the owner of the Quebec Gazette. Arguably more than any other slave owner in Quebec and indeed the province, in Quebec City and indeed the province, William Brown would have been familiar with the possibilities, the reach, the power of the fugitive slave ad, all of which hinged upon the printing of specific and often intrusive details about the enslaved person. Significantly then, all of Brown's 5 fugitive notices for Joe's escapes, dated in 1777, twice in 1778, 1779, and 1786, proclaimed that Joe had been born in Africa. The final Quebec fugitive slave notice to disclose the African birth origins of a runaway reverted to the linguistic paradigm. When the fur traders James Finlan Sr. and John Gregory placed an anonymous notice for, quote, a Negro man named Jack, end quote, they described him in part as speaking no other tongue but English and that upon a Guinea accent. Interestingly,
What kind of accent?
Guinea.
Ghanaian?
Guinea.
Ghanaian.
Yeah.
Like Guinea.
Yeah.
Okay.
Interestingly then, none of the fugitive slave notices placed to recapture these 4 enslaved males provided any indication of their ethnicity, and only one stated explicitly that the runaway had been born in Africa. The absence of statements of Africanness in Quebec fugitive slave ads does not mean that other enslaved fugitives were not also born in Africa. Other sources become useful in discerning the size and scope of these minority populations. For instance, although the brothers and business partners Matthew and John McNiders identified the enslaved Negro man fugitive named Caleb by age, height, and clothing, his origins can be ascertained through his deed of sale. Frank Mackey has determined that Caleb, who was purchased on the 26th of June, 1786 from the carpenter William Mackenzie for £35, was named in the deed as, quote, native of Guinea, about 30 years old, end quote. Different groups of enslaved people surely coped with enslavement in different ways. For the African-born, depending upon their age, the duration and intensity of their memories of home surely informed their relationship to other enslaved people, their experiences of their new societies, their slave owners, and their ability to retain their African cultures. One means of cultural attention was the preservation of African names. Berlin has noted that enslaved Africans remembered and used their real names as a form of resistance, citing runaway slave ads from Georgia, where an owner conceded that the fugitives he had named Abel and Bennett went by the names Galaga and Abram, respectively. Similarly, Philip D. Morgan also discussed enslaved people with both African and Anglo-Jamaican names at Vineyard Pen, St. Elizabeth, Jamaica, where Thomas Thistlewood was the overseer in 1750 and 51. Whether fighting to hold on to their chosen African or European names, this practice also existed in British North America. In a runaway ad placed by Azariah Pritchard in Quebec for a Negro man who he named as Isaac, Pritchard was also forced to concede that he calls himself Charles sometimes. In another case, an ad placed by James Fraser noted that an escaped Negro man went by the name Robin or Bob, and a Negro woman by Lydia or Lil. Similarly, in a notice placed by Michael Wallace for the return of a Negro man servant named Belfast, he conceded that the likely stout-made fellow of about 27 years of age goes by the name Bill. In yet another case in Nova Scotia, when Abel Mitchener of Falmouth advertised for the return of an Irish indentured male named John McNeil, an enslaved female named Phyllis, he admitted that the latter called herself Betty. In their bid to assimilate and to so-called civilize the enslaved, white slave owners regularly imposed traditional European names on their human property. For instance, enslaved males were frequently given the Irish name Mungo, spelled either with a U, M-U-N-G-O, or M-O-N-G-O. One fugitive slave ad placed by Benjamin DeWolf in Windsor, Nova Scotia in the Halifax Gazette in 1780 listed a Negro boy named Mungo, about 14 years of age, who had run away on Tuesday, October 17th. As Beth Tobin Folks asserts, quote, Mungo was a common name for African slaves and was popularized in plays like Frances Burney's A Busy Day in 1801, in which the white heiress Eliza has a black servant named Mungo, and Isaac Bickerstaff's The Padlock from 1768, which also included a black servant named Mungo. Descriptions of the enslaved body commonly included an age range, or at least an indication of adult or child status, and also description of the body type or weight, like stout, height, and importantly, complexion or racial type. However, due to the infrequency with which the enslaved were issued standard identity documents like a birth certificate, the supposed age of the enslaved was often mere guesswork. In the context of Jamaican plantation slavery, annual ledgers similar to those used to track livestock extended to the regulation of the enslaved population and would often have slave births, or list slave births, but only by the year. Far less specific were the age ranges given for child and adult slaves. The plantation ledger, a list of Negroes from Hope Estate, again 1788, did not provide specific ages for each enslaved person, but rather provided only estimates or grouped enslaved people in various age ranges. An example of the former practice with 3 male Coopers listed as an African named Wilkies, about 35, a Creole named Roger, about 30, and another Creole named Will at about 25. In the same ledger, marginal notes grouped the enslaved across the diverse ages of 1 month to 6 years, 6 years to 14 years, a group that the ledger indicated was employed as a weeding gang, and 20 to 55, or the last category, simply old and infirm. More specific, but still elusive, enslaved males named East, West, North, South, Short, Long, and Swift were noted as, quote, part of the 20 new Negroes purchased October 1787, ages 20 to 25, end quote. In Jamaica, the term Negro often became interchangeable with the word slave. For instance, Christopher Petley has demonstrated that the uber-wealthy Jamaican planter Simon Taylor, who owned 4 contiguous estates and managed several others for absentee planters, making him responsible for the management of some 4,000 enslaved people, frequently referred to the enslaved on his plantations simply as Negroes. However, the term did not necessarily indicate an African birth origin. African-born people were far less likely to be mixed race and were commonly described as having dark complexions and scarification. Enslaved Creoles could indeed also be racially unmixed and have dark complexions. Thus, while the naming of mixed African and European racial heritage in fugitive ads normally indicated that the enslaved person was a Creole, care must be taken to recall the heterogeneity of African corporeality, which transcended the idea of a uniform dark complexion and tightly curled hair. In a case related by Shane White and Graham White, James Brittanian recalled the beauty of his African-born enslaved grandmother who had hair, quote, fine as silk and hung down below her waist, end quote. The British Atlantic spawned a peculiarly detailed list of racial terms for people of African ancestry. Terms like Sambo, mulatto, and quadroon indicated a supposedly definitive racial mixture of African and European ancestry, and as such revealed almost always a Creole identity. Just as slave owners in tropical locations like Jamaica paid careful attention to the African ethnicity of the enslaved and expressed concern for the resistance of certain groups, similar preferences, albeit broader, seem to have taken root in the northern regions. For instance, in regards to the selection of laborers for his plantation Mount Vernon, George Washington preferred to buy Creole West Indians or Caribbean people who were, according to R.F. Dalzell and L.B. Dalzell, quote, thought to be preferable to Africans since they were already familiar with plantation ways, end quote. Whereas the practice of identifying the enslaved by ethnicity would have arguably persisted, if not dominated, in Jamaica until the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, the use of the term Negro as a generic term for people of African ancestry seems to have pervaded racial discourse in Nova Scotia and Quebec. Significantly, the frequent use of the term Negro implies that white slave owners did feel it necessary to name race in such ads, perhaps in part in order to differentiate between enslaved indigenous people, again known as Pani, or Africans in Quebec, at least. While Jamaican racial naming included a 6-pronged hierarchy of names, including Negro, Sambro, Mulatto, Quadroon, Musty, and Mustafino, Quebec naming practices for enslaved blacks included only Negro, Negro Mulatto, and Mulatto. While the ubiquity of the term Negro elides the specificity of African or Creole origins in Quebec, some of the fugitive ads disclose more specific information about the ethnicity of the enslaved. Within the Quebec fugitive notices, this information can be grouped in 4 categories. Number 1, those that disclose African birth. 2, those that disclose birth or origin in the USA. 3, those that indicate a Caribbean origin. And finally, 4, those that betray some anomalous characteristic unusual to 18th and 19th century residents of Quebec. This last category is the most uncertain since it is based on my educated reading of what is stated and withheld in the notices. The first category, African birth, has already been discussed. In the second category, 6 people can be potentially identified as African American Creoles. Potentially only since the notices do not always indicate the USA as their place of birth, but instead their place of residence prior to their forced migration to Quebec. The mulatto Andrew, who fled from James Crofton of Montreal, was listed as born in Maryland. A Negro named Caesar was purchased by Jean Orliat in 1773 from Garrett Van Vliet of New York. A Negro slave named Ishmael was described by his owner, John Turner, as possessing, quote, a tone of voice peculiar to New England, where he was born. A Negro lad, Nemo, was described as being born in Albany. And finally, a man named Tite and a woman named Ruth, described as a married couple, who were listed in separate fugitive notice, published over 5 years apart, had been purchased in Albany, New York. However, of the 6, only Andrew, Ishmael, Nemo were definitively born, supposedly, as opposed to from the USA. It is important to note that due to the dates of these notices, only the ones for Ishmael, Nemo, Tite, and Ruth were placed after the United States of America had declared its independence from Britain. And further, it is unclear if any of the fugitives was young enough to have been born after the declaration itself, and therefore born precisely in the USA as opposed to British North America. However, regardless of the political upheaval of the late 18th century, which led to war and a clearer articulation of distinctive regional US cultures, like Ishmael's peculiar accent, were certainly also already present during the period when these people were born. In the third category, Caribbean origin, only one Quebec notice proclaimed this explicitly. The earliest possible Caribbean listed in the fugitive notice was a Negro man named Low Caines, who escaped from the merchant and ship captain William Gill in 1775. The enslaved man may have been named after a place. Mackey has deduced that the name Low Caines may be an Anglicization of the French name Léogène, the name of a town on the island of Saint-Domingue, later Haiti, then a French Caribbean colony and the center for sugar and coffee production. Furthermore, the fact that Low Caines purportedly spoke good French but no English would align with an experience of enslavement on a French Caribbean island. A fugitive notice placed by Simon Fraser asked the public to aid him in the recapture of John Thompson, who he described as a black boy born in Spanish Town, Jamaica. Placed in the early autumn, the September weather was likely still warm enough to embolden the young Thompson, who was accustomed to a tropical climate. That Fraser, who asked for Thompson to be brought to his residence or on board the same ship, used the title Mr., would indicate that he was most likely a passenger as opposed to a member of the crew. But it is unclear if Fraser had just arrived or was preparing to sail, and thus also if Thompson had arrived on the same ship from elsewhere with Fraser, perhaps his native Jamaica, or had been purchased or hired in Montreal to accompany Fraser on an impending voyage. It seems more likely that Fraser was leaving the settlement, since if he had intended to prolonged visit or to reside in Montreal, he would likely not have given the option for the public to return the boy to the ship. The fact that the black youth had a family name and was not explicitly named as a slave may indicate that he was free. However, enslaved black sailors like Pompey, who was listed in a fugitive notice in 1771, did exist, and Fraser's ad insists upon some contract that Thompson had supposedly violated with his flight. A Negro man named Snow was, like Thompson, also likely from the Caribbean. Although listed in a fugitive notice along with another black man named Tite from Albany, the ship captain LaForce, who was involved in West Indian trade, owned the tall and slender bilingual and ironically named Snow. LaForce's travels to the Caribbean increased the possibility that Snow might have been purchased in that region. Meanwhile, although listed as a Negro slave by his female owner, the widow Perrault, Mackey claims that Alexis was a mixed-race slave, the mulatto son of a Guadeloupe-born Catherine, who had been purchased in February 1755 by the prosperous merchant Jacques Perrault for 1,275 livres. Since Catherine was a French Caribbean Creole, her son Alexis necessarily shared her Caribbean heritage, even if his father was most likely a white man. Since Perrault purchased Catherine alone in 1755 and Alexis was supposedly 18 in 1775, it would seem that he was born into slavery in Quebec when Perrault owned his mother. Given the prolific sexual exploitation of enslaved black females within slavery, it behooves us to ask if the white Perrault was Alexis's father, and if so, if the widow Perrault's slave sale notice for Catherine in the Quebec Gazette on the 4th of March, 1784, was a punitive attempt to separate mother and son. The fourth category is the most nebulous, since it is comprised of notices that did not feature specific descriptions of the regional origins of the enslaved. Nevertheless, 5 enslaved fugitives can be assigned to this category: Will, Drummond, Bell, Pascal, and Isaac. In a fugitive notice from 1768, an enslaved man described as a mulatto named Will draws attention due to his description by the owner, the Quebec merchant Elzar Levy, as speaking French, English, and Spanish. While the first 2 European languages were common amongst the free and enslaved black inhabitants of Quebec, Spanish was not. Since slave owners customarily advised the readers of the language proficiency of the enslaved, the absence of similar clarification of Will's language skills would seem to indicate that he spoke and comprehended all 3 languages well. As such, as a mixed-race man, and most likely a Creole, Will was also most likely born or raised in a region where Spanish had been spoken, regions which included the southern regions of what was to become the U.S., Mexico, Central America, South America, and Caribbean islands like Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. Drummond's language skills also trigger questions about his origins, as I mentioned before, since many enslaved people who were born or spent time in Quebec quickly became proficient in both English and French, like Tom Brooks, who was described in a Montreal fugitive notice as speaking English and French perfectly. Drummond's very bad language skills, quote unquote very bad language skills, may indicate that he was African born or purchased in a region where neither language was common. Furthermore, we can speculate that Drummond had not lived long enough in Quebec to perfect these languages. Similar to Drummond, Nemo, supposedly born in Albany, was described suspiciously as speaking English and French only tolerably. While the lack of French fluency makes sense for a man from Albany, the lack of English fluency does not. A comparison with the woman with whom Nemo is juxtaposed in the same notice, Cash, leads me to believe that she might have been African-Canadian. Specifically, it is their owner, Hugh Ritchie's refusal to provide a birth origin for the 26-year-old Cash, along with an acknowledgement that her French and English were very fluent, that leads me to believe that Cash may have been born in Quebec. An enslaved mixed-race female, Belle, seems to have shared a similar experience of a recent migration like Drummond. Belle was listed in 2 fugitive ads in Quebec Gazette, August 20th, 1778, and the 5th of November of the same year. According to Mackey, her owner, the butcher George Hips, had purchased her at auction from Thomas Venture, a ship captain. The history of her sale by Venture and the nature of his employment indicate that Belle could have been forcibly migrated on Venture's ship from outside of Quebec. This history and her mixed race identity means that, like Will, she may have been Creole. The mixed race man Pascal Perrault was also likely from outside of Quebec. Although Constant Freeman placed the ad for his escape, it explained that Perrault, described as a mulatto, was the property of John Sargent, a loyalist from Salem, Massachusetts, who settled in Barrington, Nova Scotia after the War of Independence. Perrault had apparently escaped from the schooner, from the ship Lucy, also owned by Sargent. Sargent's own origins in the U.S., his residence in Nova Scotia as a prosperous merchant, his possession of a ship, and Perrault's escape directly from it all increase the likelihood that Perrault was not from Quebec. Like the mixed-race man Will, who piques interest due to his proficiency with Spanish, Isaac's language skills similarly point towards his potential foreignness to Quebec. Isaac, listed as a Negro man in the notice, had escaped on the 29th of April, 1794, from Azariah Pritchard, senior of New Richmond, in the district of Gaspé. Pritchard described Isaac as capable of speaking good English and some broken French and Mi'kmaq. Since Mi'kmaq people were indigenous to the Maritimes and the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec, Isaac's knowledge of this language indicates his experience with these communities or individuals. Isaac's potential connection to these regions aligns with Pritchard's own history. A Connecticut loyalist, after the War of Independence, according to Mackey, Pritchard was persuaded to lead a group of refugees to the Gaspé. Therefore, while Isaac may have been an African Canadian who Pritchard encountered and purchased in the region, he could also have been African American who was forcibly relocated with Pritchard to New Richmond from the USA. If my deductions are correct, across these four categories, of the 45 people of African descent listed in Quebec fugitive slave ads, as many as 20 may have been foreign or, put another way, not African Canadian. If we remove Ireland, who had fled from New York, and one of the two men named as Jack, in the event that the two Jacks were the same person, we are still left with a sizable number of people of African descent, 18, who were from elsewhere. Due to the lack of slave ships transporting enslaved Africans from the African continent directly to ports like Halifax and Montreal and Quebec City, African-born people almost assuredly comprise the smallest population of enslaved blacks in both Nova Scotia and Quebec. While enslaved people of African birth make up approximately 16, 26 or 27% of this regionally and ethnically defined population, depending on whether Ireland and both Jacks are counted, without further information, it is still premature to conclude that African-born people were more likely to resist through flight than their black Creole counterparts, as was a popular opinion of Jamaican slave owners. As I've discussed elsewhere, Jamaican planters and overseers quickly recognized that plantations with greater numbers of African-born people were more likely to have rebellions. However, the enslaved population's knowledge of the maroon communities, combined with the continual influx of large groups of Africans on slave ships, could not have failed to have a serious influence on this pattern. Whether African or Creole, many enslaved blacks identified primarily with their African identity and cultures. In Quebec, the enslaved male Jean-Baptiste François, who apparently, upon gaining his freedom, renamed himself Jean Boucourt dit l'Africain, or Jean-Baptiste l'Africain, the African, is a case in point. Thus far, in the Quebec fugitive slave notices, 20 of 45 fugitives, that's 44%, can be identified by origin, either through the details stated explicitly in notices or in other archival sources. The enslaved populations of tropical colonies like Jamaica came to be composed primarily of two groups, an ethnically diverse group of Africans and an ever-increasing African-Jamaican or regional Caribbean Creole community due to an inter-island slave trade. In contrast, the black enslaved population of British Quebec was augmented through migration in two primary ways. First, through the inland migration of Creole African Americans and others from the regions that would become the US, and second, through the transatlantic traffic of merchant ships from the Anglo-Caribbean, which docked at ports like Halifax, Montreal, and Quebec City. Further study of the dress and cultural habits of the enslaved people of Quebec should shed light on how they retained and adapted their African and African Creole cultures, and hopefully on how they interacted and perceived each other and resisted enslavement together. Thank you.
Krishna. Oh, sorry.
That's fascinating.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. As someone who works on slavery in the Caribbean, I really appreciate your showing the fluidity. Oh, is it on? Yeah. The fluidity of these boundaries. I'll stand up. Across, you know, I mean, those of us who study the Caribbean, as you talked about the inter-island slave trade that particularly takes off after the abolition of slavery in the British colonies. But this earlier period that you're dealing with is quite fascinating for me because you're talking about the cusp of the American Revolution when the United States didn't exist, and it was also a British colony. So I was really, I mean, this is a history that we tend to forget. I mean, it really gets written out and overwritten by, you know, the 19th century, which becomes a greater focus. I was also fascinated by the ad, the runaway slave ad of the Haitian slave, in terms of, because, and so I was curious about those, you know, I know you've done work with Jamaica, but given it was a French-speaking area, you know, about the Haitian connection, because after the Haitian Revolution, Haiti gets completely isolated and cut off. And so I guess my question for you is, in terms of when we move into the cusp of the 19th century, where you have, on the one hand, the British abolition of the slave trade, and which of course allows for all of these strategies of subterfuge in terms of bringing African slaves into places where they cannot go. I mean, illegal slave markets and such. On the other hand, the kind of fear of rebellions spreading from Haiti to other places, particularly in terms of news, you know, and that travels on these ships, which are carrying potential slaves or slaves accompanying their owners who are then running away. So, so I guess my question was, have you gone any sort of further into the future to note a shift? Or is, you know, can you talk a little bit about how this is affected by the very events that are happening in the Caribbean, the United States, and then Canada?
Great, thank you so much for that question. Yes, I agree with you that first of all, slavery is utterly neglected in Canada. The average Canadian doesn't know that slavery transpired there. So I've been teaching a class at McGill I've been at McGill now 17 years. I teach a class called The Visual Culture of Slavery, and I've never had a Canadian student enter my class. In the class, about 100 people. So I've never had a Canadian student enter the class knowing that slavery transpired in Canada. And we all know the university student undergrads might be 18, 19, 20, 23, you know. So they're always shocked and appalled because from about grade 2, they get taught about the Underground Railroad and that the Canadians were always on the good end. So we've offloaded all of that baggage onto the US. We do that expertly, I'm telling you. We're very practiced. So this is all new for it's just not in the Canadian consciousness. My American students at McGill, we have about 25% American students in a class, and their blind spot is the American North. So they think it all happened in the South. So we all are guilty of, you know, amnesia on some levels. But the issue about Haiti and Haitian enslaved people, yes, people like Low Canes, who might have come from Saint-Domingue, later Haiti. So the origin stories might be different. So there's going to be a population that came in on merchant ships when the French were in control. So remember, the British take New France and rename it Quebec in 1760. So before that, their ships were coming in from places like Saint-Domingue, Guadeloupe, Martinique, et cetera. And then the British take over and it's like, hold up, now it's our turn. Only ships from British colonies are coming in. So someone like Low Canes could have been brought in under the French regime. So might have been born in the Franco-Caribbean and ends up in Quebec, but then undergoes that shift in regime too, just like everybody else. Then we have to think about the illegal coffee trade that was going on between places like Saint-Domingue and Philadelphia, even though Jefferson had embargoes going on, right? So who was on those ships beside the coffee, right? So then you might have had both freed blacks and enslaved blacks who were thrown onto those ships as quote unquote secondary cargo, who end up in a place like Philadelphia, who then get shuttled north at a certain point because their owners decide to move to another part of British North America during the Revolution. So that's another hypothesis there, just throw it out. And then the other thing too that we have to think about is, I think it's so poignant that you asked for me to just to think through Saint-Domingue and Haiti in this way, because when I was doing research in Nova Scotia, I did come across the fact that in the Halifax Gazette, they were reporting on the Revolution, of course, right? So it's something that's in the minds of the slave owners and the white colonialists in those spaces. So to think through how that's going to play out amongst the enslaved population would be an interesting thing too, especially among those who are literate. Like Joe, who I mentioned, who was listed as African-born and owned by William Brown, who owns the Quebec Gazette, Joe would have been literate, and Joe would have been forced to print ads. So Joe could have been the perfect conduit for that type of information. So there's ways in which it can start to think through the dissemination of that information into enslaved populations as opposed to just how it was used by colonialists. So thank you so much for that.
Other questions, comments? What are you doing with this? What's the larger enterprise?
Okay, so the end goal...
And you can be next.
Sorry, the end goal is a single-authored book, but so far I've published a book chapter in a book by Rutledge called Legal Violence that brought together, you know, scholars working on legal violence in all different regions and time periods. And my essay in there actually asks us to reconceptualize and to think again about this idea. I've heard this too many times, and it's always disturbing when I hear this, but there's a group of people who would like to dismiss the experiences of enslaved people in minority sites where enslaved people became the minority, as it must have been kinder and gentler because there was less of them. And I'm like, how did you come up with that? Like, where's the logic, right? So in that chapter, I actually ask us to think about the nature of isolation as a form of trauma. And the fact that for an enslaved person, for instance, in Quebec, usually you're enslaved in a household and it's just you, or you and one other person. And you see the diversity of this population. We can't even assume that two enslaved people who meet in the street can speak to each other. Someone's speaking English, someone's speaking German, someone's speaking French, and then the indigenous people are speaking indigenous language and English and or French. So we can't even assume a common language amongst enslaved and indentured people. So what did communication, what did resistance look like in a place where the enslaved population is so heterogeneous? And also when you think about African practices of bodily care, like grooming of men's beards and hair care, were communal. So what does it mean when you get, you know, you're born in Africa, if you're Joe probably had 2 transits. He probably suffered 2 middle passages. So Joe probably gets born in Africa, first initially gets taken out to a place that's probably like Jamaica or something, and then gets shipped on again and ends up in Quebec City. What the hell was that experience like? That is so traumatic, and how do we even begin to recuperate that? But also, too, for someone like Joe, or for a female enslaved person, how do you maintain the braiding style of your hair? Who then grooms you? Who teaches you about your body, right, in the absence of elders and family? And we know from the slave ads, too, that it was really common, not just in other regions, but in what became Canada, for enslaved children to be sold separate and apart from any elders or adults or family members. Right? So we need to start to think about the way that the isolation, right, and to live really under the thumb of the enslaver in the house or in the barn, you know. Literally, some of the enslaved people are listed as inventory in the barn, right? That's where they were made to sleep. And the fact, too, that Joe, on the 5 occasions when we had ads for Joe, he's always running from the print shop. And I'm like, is Joe living in the print shop? Like, what is going on with Joe in the print shop, right? Or is he just, you know, obviously extracting a lot of labor from him? But we need to think about the dimensions that would cause harm, psychological and physical harm, to the enslaved and the slave minority populations in a new type of way, I think.
Just so you know, between 1501 and 1867, there were 12.5 million Africans shipped across the Atlantic. 15% died in the Middle Passage. So that means 10.8 million got off the boats. These are all statistics from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, which is online. You can look it up right now. So 10.8 million get off the boat. Only, and this is the part that blows audiences' minds, only 388,000 came to North America, directly from Africa. Another 70,000 touched down briefly in the Caribbean, then came to North America, so 450,000. All the rest went to places south of Key West. 1 million went to Jamaica. 1 million went to San Domingue. No, 1 million went to Cuba. And 770,000 went to San Domingue, which was the name of, until 1804, January 1st of Haiti. 5 million went to Brazil. And it really puts the slave trade in perspective. And the 42 million African Americans are all, not counting recent African immigrants, right, are all descended from those 388,000. And footnote number 2, another amazing fact is that more Africans migrated willingly to the United States between 1990 and 2000 than came in the entire slave trade. Which is why about 70%, I think, this is unofficial, of the undergraduates at Harvard are not descended from 4 African-American grandparents, or, yeah, but from African, you know, recent Africans, or else they're, you know, mixed. It's very complicated, yeah. End of footnote.
Yeah.
Yes, you had your hand up.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this. And I just want to say also, I also find it really fascinating in terms of your methodology, the focus on material text of only the slave ads as a way into visualizing this history. One of the things that emerged as particularly fascinating for me was the focus on what languages were spoken and unspoken by the slaves as a way, maybe a particularly Canadian way of looking at the provenance and the whereabouts of these fugitive slaves. Especially Isaac, who speaks Mi'kmaq, a little bit of Mi'kmaq, and that particular, it was also, I think, in Maine and in the Maritimes, as you said.
Yes.
And whether or not, so that brings into question the interactivity with Aboriginal peoples and Native in Canada, which has a history, also a different history of relations with the French colonialists, and then a lot of changes in how they dealt with the British, the differences, much more brutal treatment there. And I was wondering, so part of all this as a fascinating way of emerging to get to the source of the provenance, but also of understanding perhaps why certain slaves were brought there. Was it, like for instance, was it particularly sought after to have maybe a Haitian-born slave to come to Quebec because he or she would know some French and would therefore be able to kind of navigate the landscape there better?
That's a great question. I think with a lot of the loyalists, and you see the loyalists actually, it's interesting, being named in the slave sale ads too. So when it'll say like something like, Negro woman being sold recently came from New York was such and such a loyalist, right? So in those cases, I think it's more a matter of, okay, the white loyalist is moving, he or she is taking their quote unquote property with them northward, and then they sell them there, or the enslaved person runs away there. So I think in those cases it's not a matter of going to Quebec and then looking for someone who actually is already linguistically sound. In the case of William Brown, there's some interesting information because he left some diary notes about Joe. And you'd think he would have been looking for someone in Quebec because he's the one who owned the Quebec Gazette. And I didn't show the sequence of the 5 ads, but we know Joe ran away at least one other time prior to this. Brown caught him on a ship. He made it onto a ship, and he paid a bailiff to take him off the ship and have him publicly whipped. So Joe was extraordinary. You wouldn't know so much about, you know, enslaved people if it wasn't for Joe's resistance, right? So he ran away, just Joe alone, 6 escapes that we know of. And the first ad that I showed you, Joe is named as a Negro lad who speaks tolerably well English and French. The last notice, he busts out of jail with a white criminal, and there's 2 ads for his last escape. And he's named as the pressman, and he's fluent in English and French. So it's like, like Joe himself shows the creolization process, right? But the interesting thing to your point then, you would have thought that William Brown would, in terms of language, right? He's running a bilingual newspaper. You'll notice some of these ads are in French and English, right? He'd want to look around Quebec City or Montreal and find someone who already spoke English and French. No, he wrote his buddy, William Dunlop, in Philadelphia, who was a postmaster general, and said, will you sell me your slave? I know him, and he's a good boy, of course, everybody's a boy, no one's a man, and will you sell him to me, and if not, will you send me someone? And he actually was so well versed that he knew when the ships were leaving New York and Philadelphia and when they would make it to Quebec City. So he is looking for, you'd suppose then, if he's asking him like to send him from Philadelphia or New York, an African-American Creole to be sent up to Quebec. But somehow what happens in the transaction is he gets Joe, who's African-born, who then he has to train. So you can see the insistence that Joe is never gonna get away too, because Joe is hyper-valuable, right? Joe like runs the press by the end. So unfortunately, Joe, that I know of, never escapes. He outlives Brown, and he's handed down or he's sold on out of the inventory. But I think it will vary. I think you'll have some people where language is a big deal, and they'll look for an enslaved person who had specific language skills, and in other cases, they wouldn't have cared so much. It's more their health and how strong, quote unquote, strong they were perceived to be. And you'll see that a lot of ads too talk about the person being marked with the pox as an indication that they'd already suffered and survived smallpox and therefore would not die in a smallpox epidemic. So I think health and hardiness and ability to labor was a big deal too in the context of Quebec as well.
How many of these people ran away after the Loyalists moved from the United States, what became the United States after? When did the revolution end? 1783 or 1784? I always forget.
Well, the last ads are...
Does nobody know?
Yeah.
JC, when is the revolution over? 1783 or 1784? Okay. So how many after 1783? Do you know?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I know the last sale and the last fugitive ads are 1798.
The reason I'm asking, as Charmaine knows, is that the black people who ran away in America and joined the British were granted their freedom, and after the British lost, they were relocated initially to Nova Scotia. And then some hated Nova Scotia so much, they sent emissaries to England and to get relocated to Sierra Leone. Yeah. But I'm curious about how many of these slaves were fleeing to be with the free Negroes in Nova Scotia. Do we know? Or I guess it's a stupid question. It doesn't say
no,
Negro running away to Nova Scotia.
No, that's important. I think what I can definitely say is that because of the specific migratory history of free blacks in Nova Scotia, it's very unique, right? Because you have the moment of the War of 1812, and the Revolutionary War, and then you also have the influx of about 500 Jamaican Maroons in 1796, and they agitate so much that they are like, get us the hell out of here, and they get also sent to Sierra Leone, right? But even in that moment when they were there for the whatever year or a few years they were there, there was a considerable population then of free blacks in Nova Scotia. So then you have to hypothesize then, if you're an enslaved black looking to run away, there are certain places that you know there's actually significant populations into which you might attempt to blend. So for instance, one way to deduce this, there was a 3-year window when the governor of Nova Scotia introduced a poll tax. And the poll tax, of course, just taxed people with enough property or livestock to be taxed. Of the people who are taxed, they're probably in the hundreds. Most of them are white men, and they're listed as planters or military officials, et cetera. But what I deduced is about 35 free black men. There's no black women listed, okay? So it doesn't mean that there's no free black women. It means they're not rich enough to be taxed, right? Or their household is being taxed, but the name of their husband is being listed, right? Or their father or something. But of those free black men, then, almost all of them are living in Guysborough. Right? So they're not living in Halifax. They're living in a settlement that became known for free blacks. So if you were an enslaved black at that moment in the 1790s, you probably would know that information too. And if you're fleeing from any parts of Nova Scotia, you might think, where am I going? If I can't get on a ship, I'm going to Guysborough, right? Whereas there's not the same patterns in Quebec. I'm not saying there's not free blacks, but not the same population size and not the same population patterns. So it wouldn't have been as obvious necessarily where to go. But to the excellent point part of your question about Black Indigenous relations, I did a recent lecture and tried to unpack some of that as well. And what's surprising me in that, as if you notice, again, there's only 4 terms that come up for race or complexion in Quebec. It's like you're a Negro mulatto, whatever that meant, or you're a mulatto, right? Or you're Pawnee. And I'm thinking, wait a second. If people are enslaved together and they're having community together, they're making babies together. So where are the mixed race Indigenous Black children? And what are they called? And why is there no name for them? Right? So I'm thinking that perhaps this is a problem of the misreading of these bodies, of this group of people by the slave owners, who just cannot deduce the difference between a Black, white offspring and an Indigenous Black offspring. And everybody then becomes mulatto Negro and lumped into that category, or they still call you Pawnee. They still read you as Indigenous, or they just read you as Negro. But something's going on because that population does not have a name, as opposed to the Spanish, Caribbean, and the Latino American world we know. There's a lot of different names and some specific names that were attributed, like I believe Lobo, to Indigenous Black offspring. So we need to ask why that group is missing in action in terms of the naming practices in the ads. And sorry, back to the first question, I just thought of another thing about the Haitian Revolution, and that's really important too. Another source of the way that Haitians or San Dominions might have been entering Canada is that Dessalines and George Nugent had a deal in which Dessalines allowed certain white planters to, Nugent allowed certain white planters to exit Saint Domingue and seek quote unquote refuge in Jamaica along with their enslaved people. So if any of those planters eventually moved to what became Canada, they would have taken their enslaved people with them too. So that's another way that so-called Haitian or San Domingan enslaved people might have ended up in Quebec in the British period. Yeah. Sorry? Yeah.
Okay, so I have my question. It's going to sound like a comment,
yeah,
but it's only because I'm backtracking a little bit,
sure,
and I think what you were just talking about is just so much hanging in the air still.
Okay.
For me, one, I was very struck earlier when we first began Q&A. You know, when you're sort of talking about the feeling of isolation.
Yeah.
And what does this mean for resistance? Because I've been thinking during your presentation how there's something so important in this about the informational. Okay. And thinking about, you know, so you're giving very sort of, you know, sense of interpersonal information, which is also a way we think about culture, is how we think of resistance, is how we think of relationships, right? And community, rather, community relationships. And I was thinking, though, how the way you're reading the ads in this presentation, which is just so compelling, is really about, you know, what are the strategies for transforming these fugitive slave ads into data? What can we read from them? How do we make these into data sets? Because, you know, there's always this sort of thing, sorry, I'm coming from a sort of digital perspective, but, you know, we're always thinking about the ways in which we do and do not have adequate information about slave life, or the life of the enslaved, rather. And what you're doing is you're eliciting that information. You're like, these are actually nuggets of intense information if we know how to look at it, right? Yeah. And a word you keep using in your responses to the last few questions has been deduce. This is how we deduce. So I was just thinking about that. So that's the sort of comedy part. But the question, I guess, is very simple. You know, it's just simply thinking about this data, thinking about the spatial dimension, which you've also elicited in amazing ways, like the juxtaposition between the sort of constant regional migrations and also isolation.
Right.
And so I guess my question simply is broad but intentionally so. Sort of what's next? Where can you go from here? What can you make of what you've been looking at? Because I do think there's something just so compelling here in the way you're framing it around, look, we've been looking right at these, but we're going to look again. And when we look at this, we see all these other kinds of, even the absence of information becomes a very important kind of information, but not a sort of abstract, like, ooh, way, but a very literal, can actually be mapped on a map way.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Okay, so I think then a part of what I'm looking to do, obviously, is to rehumanize the enslaved, right? Because the point of the ads was to say, this is my property, this is an object, this is in legal discourse, a piece of chattel that has run away. But what's beautiful about the ads to me is that because the owners wanted so desperately to get their quote-unquote property back, they actually give us all types of data that is completely not useful to thinking about these individuals as anything but extraordinary humans, right? It's like, dude has 5 languages, okay? And it's like, they made a plan to get away from you, right? There's a beautiful ad, I didn't show you, beautiful in quotes here, but a woman named Chloe, the ad says, she got out of the garret window by the help of a ladder and absconded with a man who was waiting for her in a canoe by the river. I'm like, Chloe had a plan, okay? Chloe thought this out. Chloe had the ladder put there when you weren't looking. She knew when you wouldn't be looking, and she had her friend or partner or lover, whoever, waiting for her in the canoe, okay? So it's like, this is not an intelligent human. Show me intelligent human, right? And the other thing that the ads do too is that they show you the isolation of the enslaved, and they show you that they were hyper-surveilled, right? Because sometimes the enslaved, the ads will tell you the hour the person escaped, not just a day. They'll say they got away between 8 and 9 o'clock. It's like, how do you know that? How do you know that unless you're watching them all the time? And again, in a slave minority community, often they live in the house with the owner. So literally, they are watching you all the time. So what does it mean then to plan the escape, right? The other thing is, too, the frequency of the times where they say, I'm sorry, I can't tell you what they're wearing, because they secreted away clothing in town, or they absconded with all of this clothing, right? But there's a brilliant one, too, where Hugh Ritchie, who's a tailor, says, you know, she took all this stuff, bonnets and petticoats, and it's really upper-class women's wear that this woman absconds with. And Hugh Ritchie, by the way, again, he's a tailor, but he also at the moment pauses and says, but she took a lot of stuff which is also hers. He actually concedes that. And we actually have to think, okay, now, so this woman, Cash, right? What are the chances then that you, Hugh Ritchie, bought her knowing that she had these skills as a seamstress, as a dressmaker, as a clothing maker, as opposed to you training her in this, right? So it's exposing the ways in which then the strategic purchasing is people, not just in terms of language, as one person posed a question, but also in terms of skill sets that they have prior to being purchased, right? But I think part of where I'm going with this too is almost to ask what in the end will be fully impossible. Hopefully it's partially impossible. But instead of always to think about what is the white slave owner's perception of these populations, I want to ask, what do they think of each other? And it's so difficult to get at that because other than extraordinary, you know, enslaved people like Joe who would have been literate, there's very few that could have left us that type of document that ends up in an archive with their opinion of themselves and their community. So it's like, how do we read the ads against the grain to try to get at that? And how do we start to think of maybe other sources that we haven't been looking at that might shed light on that? So that again, you know, part of my question was, does Joe realize he's undergoing this process of creolization as he's escaping these 5 times over the period of over a decade? Or is it just like, I'm just thinking about where my next meal is coming from, right? Like, what is it like for the intergroup politics of this community that's so extraordinarily diverse, right? But the other thing I just want to touch upon in terms of a really insightful question is, when I showed you the 2 ads for Belle, for instance, you'll notice that one of them, she runs away with no shoes and stockings on. It's like, in that case, we can read really clearly into that. There's an urgency of the moment. She's not planning to run away. Something terrible is happening to her, and she just leaves. Right? And then she runs away again, like within the span of a couple or 3 months or so. So we can read in there too, for those of us who are working on issues of sexual violence and violation and things like that, and the ad for Bet, who's big with child and running away when she's in her last trimester, we can read in that then the urgency of women who are probably living in situations where they're being sexually violated as well. And then how can we then broaden that? What other archives exist for us to start to think through ways of piecing together what their lives would have been like? And I think there's a way in which, too, I think is the really helpful question at the beginning about the fluidity of borders. As someone who works on Montreal, you know, I've read the brilliant work of Hilary Beckles on Barbados and white women slave owners in Barbados, where he argues that white women were strategically buying enslaved females and renting them as quote-unquote housekeepers to itinerant men, okay? knowing that they'd be sexually exploited and often selling the offspring off as a byproduct of those unions. There's no way this wasn't going on in a place like Montreal, Quebec City, right? Because Montreal was a garrison town for decades. There's tons of soldiers there. The ships are coming in all the time. Who are these men sleeping with? Okay, so of course there's a trade there. So the term or euphemism housekeeper doesn't emerge in the same way, but how can we read in the ads the plight of someone like Belle who's owned by a ship captain, right? And then when he leaves, he sells her, right? So is she being exploited as a type of quote-unquote concubine in the period that she's useful to him while he's in Montreal, and then he moves on, he sells her on, right? So there's ways in which I think the best practices for us to unpack and figure out the lives and experience of the enslaved is that we have to work across borders. And as you so aptly pointed out, you know, Canada-US didn't exist in most of the period of what I'm talking about. So we have to be really, really precise in regional specificity and the porousness of those borders too, in the traffic and movement of enslaved people and free blacks across those borders, I think. That will be really helpful to us moving forward. Yeah. Thank you.
In the Commonwealth in 1834, right?
Yeah. Right. But Act of Parliament, 1833 and 1844. Yeah. Yeah.
How we do? Oh, unfortunately, we're out of time. Please.
Okay. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful.
Thank you.
All the fellows will stay and we'll have lunch and orientation. And the rest of y'all got to get out of here.